All right. Well, on today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about the New Jerusalem. That's going to be the topic of conversation, at least this time and next time, as we work on finishing up Revelation 21. We've talked about the New Jerusalem before. We talked about it more the episode before last. We're going to get back into that discussion this time. And as we go into our text today, which is going to be verses 9 through 21, what we're going to see and what John is going to describe here in this passage is the beauty of the New Jerusalem. Now, remember, what we talked about before is related to the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem is not a literal city that's going to exist in the new heavens and the new earth. It's symbolically presented to us in this chapter to represent the people of God. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as a review and just to remind you how we come to that conclusion. But the beauty and also the security of the bride of the New Jerusalem, and just the imagery and the symbolic language that's used to describe this whole thing of the New Jerusalem and the picture that's drawn in our minds is deliberately described and given to us to really, just stretch things to the limit, just as far as, how we can understand things. And it's really supposed to communicate to us that this is, we're dealing with a people that's ultra beautiful and ultra safe. And it's even saying ultra this or ultra that is, I think is a little bit of an understatement. But again, that's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the text that we're going to be dealing with now. Like I said, it's going to be verses 9 through 21 of Revelation 21. Still not the end of chapter 21. We'll probably go ahead and finish that up next time. But we're coming all the more closer to the end of our study of the book of Revelation. I feel like it's been a good journey, and I hope that you feel the same way. But as it relates to this episode, we got some good things coming up, so I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, Revelation chapter 21. Let me go ahead right off the bat and just read the passage that we're dealing with here. Like I said, it's chapter 21 of Revelation, verses 9 through, and you know what? Actually, not just 9 through 21. I'll go ahead and read through the rest of the rest of the chapter, even though we're not going to be covering verses 22 through 27. Okay, so this is Revelation chapter 21, starting in verse 9. And it says, "Then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, 'Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb.' And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. Its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall on the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies foursquare, its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. He also measured its wall, 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. The wall was built of jasper, while the city was pure gold like clear glass. The foundation of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, and the 12 amethyst, and the 12 gates were 12, and the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. And I saw no temple in the city. And by the way, I just finished verse 21. That's where we're going. That's what we're going to be looking at. But let me go ahead and read verses 22 through 27. This is what we're going to look at next time. It says, "And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. And its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. They will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations. But nothing unclean will enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life." Okay, so that's the rest of chapter 21. But as I said, we're going to be looking at verses 9 through 21 this time, and then finishing up chapter 21 in verses 22 through 27 next time. But before we get into the details of our passage for this episode, you know what time it is. It is time for the shameless plug for my book. Once again, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com is the main places where you can get that. I've noticed I'm having trouble for some reason just saying Barnes and Noble really quick. I kind of noticed that the last few times, and I guess that's always been the way that it's been, but I don't know why I get tongue-tied when it gets there. Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com are the two main places that you can order that. As usual, I'll leave a link in the episode description, so it'll take you straight to the Amazon page, and you can order a copy. Again, the book is a study of Jesus' words in the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21. Read it and be blessed. Okay, so I guess just to start out here, remember where we were last time. Because the passage that we looked at last time, which was verses 5 through 8, was kind of a pause. I think that's the word that I used to describe that. Because the time before last, we were looking at the past couple of times before last time, we were looking at the not only the New Jerusalem, but it mentioned John seeing the new heavens and the new earth. So those verses put together, verses 1 through 4. It's just describing, the things of the future and how things are entering into the eternal state. We're being introduced into that time. Starting in verse 2, we read about the New Jerusalem, and we also read about God dwelling with his people and how there's no more death or mourning or crying or pain and everything like that. So those are the things that describe the conditions of the eternal state, the New Jerusalem, which is what we are looking forward to ultimately. Okay, but then when we were looking at verses 5 through 8 last time, remember how the language that the Lord uses in this passage is present progressive term. He uses present progressive terms, specifically where he's talking about making all things new, and how he seems to focus on the whole thing of redemption. That's what he's accomplishing right now in history, leading up to that end time. So when we get to that end point, and when we enter into the eternal state, that whole mission of redemption will be accomplished. Everybody who God intends to redeem and save will have been redeemed and saved, and they will enter into the eternal state in the new heavens and the new earth. So that range of verses 5 through 8, is just kind of, I guess you could just kind of see as a pause there that, that kind of points to, okay, we just finished looking at, the eternal state. And leading up to the eternal state, this is what we're working towards right now. This is the process that's going on to work our way to that. Okay. And so I think it was a very profitable discussion, just what we looked at last time. And, I would encourage you to go back and listen to it again if it encouraged you the first time you listened to it. I mean, these are the sorts of things that we need to be encouraged by over and over again. And we need to encourage one another with these words and the promises that are laid forth for us in Scripture. even as it relates to the end and the second coming of Christ. I mean, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4 to encourage one another with these words. So I would truly take that command to heart and, be active in speaking about these things for your own encouragement and for the encouragement of others. But anyway, now that we're getting back into verse 9, and as you saw, as we read from that passage, it's almost as if it's a reintroduction to the new heavens and the new earth that we just saw a few verses before. So this is who we're talking about: the new heavens and the new earth, and the new Jerusalem before the pause, and now after the pause in verse 9. We're brought back into this whole thing of the subject of the New Jerusalem, where it says, then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." Okay, so and even I guess even if you go into verse 10, it says, "And he carried me away in the spirit to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God." Okay, so that's very similar language to what we saw in verse 2, where John says, "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God." Okay, and then it says, "Prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." And remember, when we talked about the New Jerusalem, when we were going over that passage, when we were going over those verses, remember, and even then wasn't the first time that I'm mentioning this, but the New Jerusalem is not is not supposed to depict a literal geographic location, a geographic city that's going to exist within the new heavens and the new earth. And I guess you could say, who knows? And maybe there is going to be a city in the new heavens and the new earth called Jerusalem. But I'm just saying that that's not what is being spoken of here when it's talking about the New Jerusalem. And the clue of this, there's a few clues here and there. We've gone over these before. But again, just as a reminder, again, it says, "Then I saw in verse 2, it says, "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." Now, when you skip down to verse 9, we come back to that whole thing of bride language. Except, again, we talked about this before. It's that, it says, "Then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, 'Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb.'" Now, we know who the bride is. The bride is the church, the people of God. Okay, and I don't think you're going to get any dispute on that. But again, even as you go into verse 10, what we see here, what do we see as a description of the bride? The New Jerusalem. Okay, New Jerusalem coming down out of. So, in other words, and we've talked about this before, but again, just as a review and as a reminder, the New Jerusalem is the bride of Christ. That is the New Jerusalem that's being talked about and discussed in this passage is a description, a symbolic picture of the people of God. Okay. And just to reinforce the fact, and again, this is something that we've went over as well, but again, just as a reminder, remember the language that we just read there in our passage in Revelation 21 is very similar to what we've already encountered in contrast form to the harlot, right? So if you were to go back to Revelation 17, at the beginning of that chapter, it says, "Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls." Remember, that's what we saw in verse 9 of chapter 21. So here in chapter 17, we have the same thing with one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk." Now, verse 3 of chapter 17, it says, "And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness." Okay, so that's where they're showing the where the harlot is. But then in verse 10 of chapter 21, you read similar language where he says, "And he carried me away in the spirit to a great high mountain." So not the wilderness as in chapter 17, but a great high mountain in chapter 21. So still in verse 3, It says of chapter 17, and he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, so then it goes into the whole thing of describing the prostitute, okay, who rides the beast. Okay, so here again, you see the similar language. And he, again, in verse 10 of chapter 21, and he carried me away in the spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. So in chapter 17, where we're shown the reality of the great harlot, the prostitute, here, is saying, we're saying that it's saying that I'm going to show you who the bride is. And then what was shown to him in verse 10, he showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. So this shouldn't be controversial. I mean, just as far as interpretation here. And as far as saying that the New Jerusalem is not talking about a literal geographic place existing in the new heavens and the new earth. No, the New Jerusalem that's being described here in chapter 21 is the people of God. In other words, the bride of Christ. And so we've talked about the whole thing with when it comes to the new heavens and the new earth, how, there's the coming together of the bride and the bridegroom, Christ and his bride, in the full bride, the complete people of God, as we talked about in times past before. And so that's what we're talking about. So I just wanted to lay that out there, just as a reminder to reinforce the fact and the reality of what we're dealing with here. Okay. Now, going back into verse 10 here, where it says, and he carried me away in the spirit to a great high mountain. This it kind of is reminiscent of what you read as far as the words that are laid out in Ezekiel chapter 40. And specifically in verses 2 and 3. In fact, there's a couple of areas 2 or 3 other areas in here in chapter 21 that resemble very much what we read in Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, which is the description of the temple that's measured in Jerusalem. And so, this is one of the similarities there, where it's talking about, where the vision is seen in Ezekiel. What's being observed is being observed from a high mountain. And the whole thing, even with the measuring that takes place, you see a measuring that happens here in Revelation chapter 21. Okay. Now, the difference, though, is that in Ezekiel, what's being measured is the temple. There's a temple measurement. Here in Revelation 21, what's being measured here is a city. And I think what's of note here, and even when you take into account, we don't need to go into all the details of what you see as far as the measurements and everything that goes into Ezekiel 40, chapters 40 through 48. But one thing that you'll know is that the dimensions that are described there and all the measurements that are laid out there are laid out in a way that is supposed to communicate to the readers that the measurements there are out of this world. Okay. The same thing, the same intention is made here as it relates to the measuring of the city of the New Jerusalem, but even on a much more grander scale than what we see in Ezekiel. I think that very possibly what you're dealing with there is in Ezekiel is something that finds its final consummated fulfillment here in Ezekiel 21, but the dimensions and the measurements that are laid out here are ones that stretch the limit here. And even with what we're dealing with as far as what is measured, I think gives us a little bit of a clue of that, because in Ezekiel, you're just talking about the temple. Now it's expanded and it's brought into a whole thing where we're measuring not just an edifice, a building, but an entire city. Dennis Johnson here has in his book, Triumph of the Lamb, has something interesting to say about that. I'll read that to you a little bit later. But that's what we're dealing with there. And so I think that as far as, so the difference is in what is measured between the two passages, but the similarities between the two is that the measured dimensions are supposed to communicate something that's out of this world. Okay. So that's what we're dealing with. Just so you have in mind, just kind of the comparisons that we're dealing with, just as it relates to what we have here in Revelation 21 and the Old Testament, because a lot of what John lays out in the entire book of Revelation, and you're very familiar with this if you've been with us through the entire study, are things that John draws from, and what he's shown are things that are drawn from Old Testament scripture. So it's very helpful to be familiar with what's laid out in the Old Testament. Okay, so again in verse 10. It says, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Now, verse 11, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. Okay. Now, here's the whole thing where it says that the city has the glory of God, having the glory of God. Now, I think you can see this in a couple of ways. I mean, we think about the glory of God, and especially when we're looking at it and we're thinking about it in Old Testament terms, we think about the Shekinah glory and the bright light, and the whole thing that represented God's presence within among His people. Especially if you're talking about the wilderness wanderings, when in the temple and everything. Excuse me, not the temple, the tabernacle, by day and by night, a pillar of fire by day and a pillar of fire by a cloud by day and fire by night. I'm having trouble getting all of that out of my mouth, but we kind of think along those lines, and other things as it relates to the bright light, the Shekinah glory of God, among His people. And in the same way, I think you can see that here, and in a certain sense, this is even a more illustrative picture of what we've seen described before in earlier verses in chapter 21 about God dwelling with His people. Okay, and I think that here again you have a certain sense of it, but in another sense, I think this is communicating something else to us as well, because in verse 11 it says having the glory of God, its radiance like the most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It's radiance, and I think, and to a certain degree, when we're looking at what we're going to see here as it relates to the description of the New Jerusalem, what we're dealing with here is, as far as its beauty and the beauty that's described, what we have to understand as it relates to the beauty and the glory of God being within the city of the New Jerusalem is that the true beauty of the city comes from none other than God Himself, and that the beauty that is described is radiating the very glory of God. So in other words, this isn't a beauty in and of ourselves, okay? This is a beauty that only comes from God Himself. He is the one, and the glory that it radiates from the city is what is the large contribution, I guess you could say, that makes this city beautiful. It talks about the bride being adorned for her husband. And remember, when we talked about that, we said that the adorning is something that is a work of God Himself, not anything of us or that we're able to do on our own. Okay. And so all of this is a work of God so that He does get the greater glory as it relates to the complete beauty of the complete people of God. And I think that that's something that's very important for us to understand and to realize. Now, it says its radiance is like a most rare jewel. I mean, if you talk about a jewel that's rare, it speaks of its value, right? So this is the description here is supposed to give us something that's talking about something that's very valuable, given its rarity. But it's saying like the radiance, like a most rare jewel, like a jasper. Now, we've seen the description of God on His throne way back in chapter 4, and it's talking about, how His appearance was like jasper. In verse 3, I believe it is, of chapter 4, it says, and He who sat there, which is God, although this is not a real description of God. God is, spirit, but again, is saying that, and He who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around Him the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Okay, so it's very interesting. Just you have jasper, you have carnelian, you have an emerald, and this whole description of a rainbow. Those things are revisited here in chapter 21 as well, and especially when we're talking about a rainbow, we're talking about something that's multicolored here. I think you get the same sense when you see the description of all of these precious jewels that are laid out here. In Revelation chapter 21. So you see the similarities here from chapter 4 and even what you see here in chapter 21. But again, what I want to draw your attention to again is the whole thing of that the radiance is like jasper, clear as crystal. Okay, and the jasper going back to the description of God on his throne in chapter 4. Now, it says like jasper, clear as crystal, and jasper is not clear. So again, the language that's used here is deliberately, and you're going to see the same thing as it relates to the description of the gold of the city as well. But here, as it relates to the jasper, which is not a clear, jewel by any means, is described as clear as crystal. So again, the descriptions here are supposed to give us a symbolic understanding of what we're talking about here. And as I said before, these are descriptions that are supposed to be stretched out to the limits. And even with something that our finite minds will try and grasp and understand. I mean, it's the way that we're supposed to receive this as it's communicated to us. To use the words that I mentioned before, is that these are things that are out of this world. Okay. And that's what's supposed to center on our minds here. Now, when we get into verse 12, here's where we get into the security. Because I said that this passage talks about the beauty and the security of the people of God. Okay. And so it talks about its security in verse 12. It said it had a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the 12 gates, 12 angels, and on the gates, the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. Now, we'll talk about the 12 tribes of Israel here in a second, but let's observe again here in verse 12 that it had a great high wall. Okay. Now, walls in ancient times, and maybe in some places even today, but I mean, in the ancient world, this is obviously something that was very relatable back then. You had walls that were built around cities, and Jerusalem was no exception. And of course, we read that in Scripture as well regarding the walls of Jerusalem. But if you're talking about any walled city, the idea of a city having walls was for its protection. Okay, to protect it from intruders and invaders and attacking armies and that sort of thing. It was meant to protect the inhabitants of the people of the city, the citizens of the city that were inside. Okay. And so as it relates to the New Jerusalem here, what's described here is that it had a great high wall. Now, how high is this wall? Well, we're going to get to that a little bit later when it gets to the actual dimensions that are laid out of the city. And again, the dimensions that are laid out is supposed to tell us that we're dealing with something that's out of this world. But take my word for it now. Again, we're going to see it a little bit later, but take my words for it now is that the description of this is supposed to be off the charts. Okay. Now that, in addition to the fact that it says in the middle of verse 12, it says, and at the gates, 12 angels. Okay. And the angels are meant to guard, these gates. So the impression that you get is that these are angels that are guarding the way so that nobody can get in. It kind of has a little bit of a semblance of the angels, the seraphim in the Garden of Eden, that guards the way to the tree of life so that nobody could take it. That sort of thing. I mean, the symbolic language isn't used here in Revelation 21, but I mean, just as far as guarding is concerned, you kind of get the sense that, the angels are guarding, and protecting the people of God. Now, again, all of this is symbolic language, which is supposed to tell us something. So this isn't anything that's supposed to tell us, the readers or the hearers in the first century, that if the walls weren't high or thick, as we're going to see again when we get to the dimensions, if the walls weren't high or thick, and if you didn't have the angels there, then the people of God would be in danger of exposure and, and being attacked by enemies and that sort of thing. That's not what it's supposed to convey. That is, that if you take away those things, then the people of God would be in danger. Again, these are pictures that are supposed to, give us a vivid visual picture of the reality of how protected the people of God are. And we know that the people of God in the new heavens and the new earth are going to be protected from enemies of any sort, because all the enemies have been destroyed, right? They're now forever, being tormented in the lake of fire, which is the second death. So there aren't going to be any more enemies. But again, the picture that's being painted here is that, in the new heavens and the new earth, there's not going to be any sort of danger of anything new coming in as far as sin, wickedness, enemies that will bring up sin and enemies and that sort of thing. All of those things is not going to be in the new heavens and the new earth, and there's nothing like that that's going to touch the people of God. Okay, and so that's where the security comes in. Once we have the complete people of God, that is it, and they are protected and they are safe, and they will get to enjoy the benefits of the new heavens and the new earth with their God in their presence forever, and nothing is going to ruin that. Okay, that's the picture that's supposed to be conveyed when it comes to that sort of thing. Okay, so you have a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. Okay, and then in verse 13 it goes on to talk about 3 on each of the directional areas: 3 on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 gates on the west. Okay, now I want to take this whole thing of the 12 tribes of the people of Israel and combine it with what we're exposed to in verse 14. Because in verse 14, it goes on to say, "And the walls of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb." Okay, so those two things are meant to be taken together. Okay, I believe. The 12 tribes of Israel, the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, which are inscribed on the gates in verse 13, and then the foundations of the wall of the city have the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And so in verses 13 and 14, I mean, you have a whole concept of Old Testament, New Testament being brought together. And since this is the city, the New Jerusalem, which is supposed to communicate the whole thing of the people of God, I think what we're dealing with here, when we're bringing these two things together, the 12 tribes of Israel and the names of the 12 apostles, is the whole thing of the complete people of God being brought together as the whole story of the Old and the New Covenant has finally come to its complete conclusion. Okay? And I think that's very important for us to understand, given the fact that there are a lot of people out there, when they look at redemptive history and as it relates to the Jews in the Old Testament and what's going on in the New Testament and even in the present age, you look at what happened with our Lord Jesus Christ when he came to earth. He was crucified. And so a lot of people will say that that's when God's plan for Israel was set aside temporarily. So in redemptive history, he hit the pause button on his whole thing with his plan for Israel, and then he turned to the Gentiles, as if the Gentiles and the church that followed after the time of Christ was kind of like a plan B. Now, again, not everybody, I would say would believe that. I'm hesitant to paint everybody with a broad brush, but many people do. Okay, and I think that that's completely wrong. Now, I think we'll go into detail as to why I think that way after we finish Revelation and we cover some episodes that kind of tie up some eschatological loose ends. Like I said, I think I'm going to take some weeks to cover some things to tie up some eschatological loose ends, and this might be one of them. But really, if you really look at the Old Testament for what it actually is, you see that what we're dealing with is what God's plan has been in redemptive history all along. I mean, even when you look at the Old Testament and the people of Israel, the people of Israel was just a starting point of what God had in mind of bringing the whole world into relationship with him. Okay, the Israelite people were supposed to serve as a light to the nations. Now, the thing is that they didn't do such a good job of that, because God said, my name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. But their whole thing was they needed to be a light to the Gentiles. Why? To rub it in the Gentiles' faces that Israel was the people of God? No, it was supposed to be something to draw them in. So this one, that was a thing in the Old Testament, right? And even when we look at some of the people in the Old Testament, okay, when we look at some of the people in the Old Testament, we come to understand that, and I don't think we even think about along these lines, but some of the people in the Old Testament, I think, is supposed to give us an indication and a clue that while we're dealing primarily with Israel in the Old Testament, in many ways, it's supposed to go beyond that. I mean, even when you look at, Jesus' genealogical line, and even with, for example, the women that show up there in the genealogical line, you see that not everybody in there, was a full-blooded Israelite, right? You think about Tamar, not an Israelite, but she's in the Messianic genealogical line. Rahab, another example, not a full-blooded Israelite, totally, completely as Gentile as they come. Same thing with Ruth, right? Who was a relative of it, who from her line, you get David, and then so forth and so on, leading up to the Messiah. So I think even there you see clues of what God is up to as it relates to bringing people from all over the world in submission to him and in right relationship. Okay. And so the plan that you see in the Old Testament and what you see in the New Testament, obviously with the New Testament with the apostles, and their whole thing was, go and make disciples of all nations, right? So you have Israel in the Old Testament that was supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. You have the New Testament with the 12 apostles who were given a commission to make disciples of all nations, and that would be the commission of the church, because obviously that's not something that the 12 by themselves would do. They would preach to people, and primarily they started out preaching to Jews, and then those Jews would preach to other people until eventually it reached to Gentiles, and before you know it, you have the spread of the gospel covering the whole world, right? And so all of that was in the plan of God, again, starting with Israel. And even when you get to the apostles and you look at Acts chapter 1, Jesus himself, before he ascended, said, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." So what we see here in Revelation 21, I think, again, we see the completion of God's redemptive plan. And that fits in well, I think, to what we talked about before last time when we were talking about what is God up to. God is up to bringing to completion what he started way back in the Old Testament, right? And so that's why I think you can have, the 12 tribes of Israel, the names of them inscribed on the gates of the city, and on the foundations, the 12 apostles of the Lamb inscribed on the 12 foundations. So you're bringing those two things together to show us the complete fulfillment of God's plan of creating the complete people of God, as we see here. Okay, which includes, Jews, Gentiles, and all manner of Gentiles as well. It was what we're exposed to in redemptive history. Okay, and I think that's what we're supposed to take away from this when we're bringing those two things together. Okay. All right. So when we look at, trying to see here, in verse 15. And it says, and the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates, and its gates and walls. Okay, and so again, the similarities in language. I mean, again, you see that in in the prophecies regarding the measuring of the temple in Ezekiel. And particularly, I believe it's in that area in Ezekiel chapter 40 where it describes somebody with a measuring line and they're going to measure the temple. But again, dealing here with an entire city, we see that things are expanded a little bit more, okay? And by the way, you kind of see the same thing, even within the book of Revelation as well, because, another thing, if this brings to your mind what we've looked at before in chapter 11, when, for example, at the beginning of chapter 11, it says, "Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, 'Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample this holy city, the holy city, for 42 months. Okay, now if you remember from our discussion of there, we saw that from those verses, we saw two sides of a same description here of the people of God. That area which is measured, which is protected, and we're talking about spiritual protection there, but the outer court that's not measured is the same people of God who are going to be exposed to persecution, which again is personified in what we see in the two witnesses later on in chapter 11. What we see is the saints being oppressed by the beast in chapter 13. We see all of those things, but again, you have the measuring of one section of the temple, but then there's another part of the temple that's not measured, which shows us that there's going to be exposure to persecution. But now here in chapter 21, again, the picture expands. We're doing another measurement, but we're not just doing a measurement of the temple. Now we're doing the whole city, and there's no portion of the city that's left out. Notice that. The whole city is going to be measured here, which again, if we're taking the interpretive language of what we talked about in chapter 11 and transfer it over into chapter 21, if the whole city is measured, the whole city is protected and kept safe. Which again is another thing that points to what we talked about before as far as the security of the people of God in this new environment, in the new heavens and the new earth, right? Okay, but it says there in verse 15, it says, and the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and its walls. Now, before we get into the details of the dimensions of the New Jerusalem and everything, I want to take time to read, and I said I'd do this here. I want to read something here from Dennis Johnson's book. There's a book, Dennis E. Johnson wrote a book. This copyright is 2001, so a little over 20 years ago. Or a book was published. He published a book, and I think I may have made brief mentions of it here and there, very briefly throughout our entire study. But the book is called Triumph of the Lamb, a commentary on Revelation. A book that I recommend, by the way. If you can order a copy of this, I would recommend you get your hands on a copy here. Published by, let's see here, P&R Publishing. And in this description of what he's going to talk about as far as the measuring of the city and everything, I want to read this paragraph to you because I think that Mr. Johnson here describes it in a way that's better than I could, I think. But here's what he says. He says, having sketched the general outline of the city with its walls, with its wall, gates, and foundations, John now adds dimensions and color to the portrait. The angel he now sees has a gold measuring rod for the purpose of measuring the city, its gates, and its wall. The imagery is derived from Ezekiel's vision of a temple to follow Israel's return from exile, which is measured by an angel, a man whose appearance was like bronze, as the prophet watched intently. And he references Ezekiel 40, verses 3 through 5. In Ezekiel 40 to 42, the precise measurement of each and every feature of this vast visionary temple, extending for 91 verses, dramatizes God's promise to the Jewish exiles in Babylon that the promise of his presence and love will yet see a new and unimaginable fulfillment. That fulfillment focuses on the incarnation of the Son of God, tabernacling among us, and he references John 1:14 and also 2:19 through 21, and reaches its consummation in the New Jerusalem, which needs no separate building to function as its sanctuary, quote, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple, end quote, of what he's referencing there of Revelation 21:22. One last thing he says here, he says the dimensions that John is about to report dwarf those of Ezekiel's temple, showing not only the symbolic nature of the vision, but also, more importantly, the breathtaking majesty and magnitude of Christ's church. So I think that that's very, very well described in that paragraph there. So I wanted to take some time to read that. But again, even in what Dennis Johnson says there, the whole thing about God tabernacling among us. Remember, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, and when we're talking about the New Jerusalem and how God will dwell with His people, and we will be His people, and He will be our God, and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's what we're dealing with when we're getting into the dimensions here. And like I said, and like Mr. Johnson here says, that the dimensions here are clearly symbolic, and they dwarf even what is laid out in Ezekiel. And again, even if we're considering the fact that in Ezekiel, as grand as the description of the measurements that's just the temple. Now we're talking about a city itself, a city which is described as not needing a temple anymore, because God will be the people's temple. Okay, but it's talking about the measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. Verse 16, it says the city lies foursquare. Its length, the same as its width. So that's obviously a perfect square. But as we're going to see here, it's actually what we're actually looking at here is a cube. He says, and he measured the city with its rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. There's where you get the whole cube thing. And this is a good cube as opposed to a bad cube. I'm thinking about a bad cube. I'm thinking any Star Trek fans with the Borg. You remember how the Borg had the cube ship. And even here, the description of the new heavens and the new earth, the cube dwarfs the Borg cube ship by a large margin. So here we have a perfect cube. So you not only have an equal length and width, but you also have a height as well, which is equal. And what you have here as the measurement of that, it says there in the middle of verse 16, and he measured the city with its rod, 12,000 stadia. Okay, 12,000 stadia. Now 12,000 stadia is pretty big. Okay, first of all, let me just say that, as it relates to the number 12,000, we've run into the number 12,000 before, as it relates to the 144,000 sealed Jews back in chapter 7. Now remember, in our study of that, we saw that what was meant to be portrayed from that, from that is the complete people of God, made up of both Jews and Gentiles, just based on the ranking of the names in that list, and the sons of the concubines being raised in that list to, more prominent rankings and that sort of thing. Don't have time to go into all of that now. Maybe you can go back and listen to that episode as a reminder. But there you see 12. 12 is throughout Revelation is considered the number of the people of God. So you have 12,000 from each tribe in chapter 7. You have 12 times 1,000. 1,000, meaning a great number. Remember, that's what we saw as it related to the 1,000 years, in Revelation 20. And even in chapter 7, after we looked at the 144,000 sealed Jews, we have a great multitude. It's another description of the same group of people, okay? Now here, we're talking about the people of God, and its measurements, you see that there's 12, it's measured in its measurements, length, height, and width is 12,000 stadia. Now, what the heck is 12,000 stadia? What is that ultimately amount to? Well, 12,000 stadia. Now, I've heard actually a couple of possibilities. There's a better part of over 1,300 miles. I've heard in a couple other resources that it's actually 1,500 miles. 1,500 miles. Let's actually use the more conservative, more conservative measurement. Not to say anything against 1,500, but again, just to show you that the more conservative number of 1,300, precisely actually 1,380. That's still pretty big. 1,380 miles is 12,000 stadia. So you're talking about a city that's length and width is that long in miles, and its height, because it's equal in height as well. So you're talking about. So do you see how this is supposed to be a symbolic picture and not something that's literal here? And again, as I mentioned before, this is supposed to be something that's supposed to stretch to the limits. It's supposed to give us this big, grand view saying, get a load of this, right? And so again, if we're going back to the security issue and talking about high walls, so just imagine how it's saying that the walls are high. The walls would be that height, 1,300 miles. Okay, so again, we're not talking about a literal city here. 1,300 miles, 1,380 miles is a big real estate. It's not saying that there's a literal geographic city that's going to cover that much. Okay, it's supposed to give us this symbolic understanding that's supposed to tell you, wow, this is going to be, as far as the description of the people of God, this is something else. Okay, that's what it's supposed to communicate there. And he goes on to say in verse 17, he also measured its wall 144 cubits. And so there you have 12 times 12, which I think, again, is supposed to bring, is supposed to have this whole idea of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel and the 12 apostles, bringing those together. And then now you have this number of 144. And so it says he also measured its wall 144 cubits. Okay, so the cubits, 144 cubits equals 216 miles. And I think that this aspect, this description of the wall is measuring its thickness. So you mean to tell me that there's going to be a literal city with walls that are which thickness measures out to be 216 miles? I don't think so. Now, I'm not saying, that's not to say that God couldn't do that, or couldn't construct that if he wanted to. Of course he could. But if we're taking this to be a literal understanding, we're missing the point here. And again, if we're talking about a thickness, not only the height of the city, but the thickness, doesn't that portray to you? And again, we're talking about walls here. Even if we're talking about walls, again, walls in the ancient world was meant to protect from intruders and invading armies. Do you think, in the real world, even take anything outside of what we're looking at symbolically, if we were to say that something like this literally happened, do you think that would we be able to say that this is probably an impregnable fortress? Yeah. You're not going to have somebody who's going to be able to scale a wall that's over 1,300 miles high, or dig through a wall that's 216 miles thick, right? Now, of course, that's, that defies, what we think of as far as reality. But again, the intention is to show you want to see how secure the people of God are in this new environment. That's how much. It's supposed to stretch our minds, and it's supposed to stretch our imaginations to the limits to show how ultra secure the people of God are here in the new heavens and the new earth. Okay, that's what it's supposed to show us here. Now it says here, he also measured its wall 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. Which again, I think it's saying it's human measurement in the sense that it's given to us in dimensions and numbers that, in some way, we're to understand. I mean, if we do the calculations and everything, we understand by human measurements that's out of this world. But it's also the angel's measurement in the sense that we're supposed to look at this symbolically. In other words, this is supposed to tell us that, even though from human measurements, this is out of this world, from an angelic measurement, this is a spirit that has a spiritual meaning to it, which is, again, as I mentioned before, is supposed to show us just how out of this world the security of the people of God are. Okay. Now, verse 18, it says, the wall was built of jasper. So there's the reappearance of the jasper again. While the city was pure gold like clear glass. So there it is again. And I mentioned we'd come up on this before. Pure gold like clear glass. And so even the most refined gold isn't going to be clear as glass. Okay. So again, this is language that's supposed to stretch our minds to the limit to just show us how ultra beautiful, I guess you could say, this is, as if we're talking about gold and its appearance and everything like that. Everything having to do with that, the foundations of the wall. Okay. So it says it was adorned with, in verse 19, it says the foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. And so he goes into a list of these 12 jewels. The first was jasper, the second, sapphire, the third, agate, the fourth, emerald, the fifth, onyx, the sixth, carnelian, the seventh, chrysolite, the eighth, beryl, the ninth, topaz, the 10th, chrysoprase, the 11th, jacinth, the 12th, amethyst. Okay. So those, so in verses 19 and 20, you have the list of those jewels there. Now, here's the significance, I think, that we grasp from the whole thing of the list of those. The list of those here, and again, this is the description of the foundations of the wall. So the foundations of the wall, and remember, the foundations are, on the foundations are listed the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Most of these, not all of these, most of these, I think we're talking about 9 here. 9 of these jewels here that are listed in chapter 21 show up as jewels that line the breastplate of the high priest in Exodus chapter 28. I believe it's verses 17 through 20. I don't remember specifically the verses. I think that's it. But it talks about, the apparel of the high priest and how the high priest is supposed to have a breastplate. And on the breastplate, it's supposed to have 4 rows of 3 stones each, and on each of them is inscribed a name of one of the tribes of Israel. Okay, and so here's the thing: it's interesting. Actually, let me back up. And like I said, there's 9 of what's listed here in chapter 21 make up what's on the breastplate of the high priest in Exodus chapter 28. With the exception of carnelian, chrysolite, and chrysoprase, all the other ones show up on the breastplate. Although, and I think this was in Johnson's book, I think one of the things that he said is that one of the things that John may have done with those, as it relates to the rest of them, the other 3, is kind of named the other 3, like kind of given them like kind of an interpretive name. That is drawn from something that's outside of the Septuagint, as it relates to what shows up in Exodus chapter 28. I think that's something that Johnson said. Whether that's it or not, I don't know. But I think largely, what this is supposed to call to mind is what we see in Exodus 28. Okay, and what you have in Exodus 28 with those jewels and inscribed on those is the name of the tribes of Israel. But here in chapter 21, these are the jewels that adorn the foundations, which have inscribed on them the names of the 12 apostles. So again, I think what we're dealing with here, as it relates to the foundations, is again bringing the readers and the hearer's mind to the understanding that there's a merging of these two things to kind of depict the complete fulfillment of God's plan as it relates to redemption that goes all the way back to the Old Testament and brings its fulfillment in the New and works its way up to this final end here, this final point where we enter into eternity with the complete people of God. That's what we're supposed to deal with there. And again, even if you go back and look at the language that Paul uses in places like Ephesians chapter 2, where it talks about God's household, being supported by the foundation of the apostles and prophets. That's something that calls to mind if we're familiar with other places in the New Testament as well. Okay. So, all of that to say, though, I think that with the list of those jewels in verses 19 and 20 is supposed to call our minds to that. So again, what this shows us here is that we're dealing with a God who brings to completion what he has planned. Okay. And I think that that's truly an amazing and a truly comforting thing. Now, once we get into the last verse here, verse 21, it says, "And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl," which again, that is unusual. You're not going to see a pearl that big, making up a gate like that. It's just, again, this is supposed to show us how the descriptions here are supposed to stretch things to the limits here, just as far as what our minds can wrap around and what it can comprehend, right? It says, "And 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold like transparent glass." So again, that's kind of a repeat of what we talked about as far as the gold mentioned in verse 18, talking about the whole city. And one of the things that I read about this, because it was talking about the whole city being a pure gold, clear like glass. Here it's talking about the streets of gold, like transparent glass. And I fail to remember the reference there in Zechariah, but there's a description in Zechariah where it's talking about just like, there are certain features like in the holy place where there's gold, even some of the common things like pots and utensils and things like that, the common things that people use in everyday life will be made of gold. Again, kind of showing how, it kind of helps. And I should have nailed this down a little bit more when I came in here, but there's a certain sort of thing that's supposed to be communicated, I think, from that. It shows how we're not just seeing, the purity and the beauty of things from a distance, even with, as it relates to what we see here in chapter 21, the streets where people would actually walk is made of gold. So it's not something where we're looking at things from a distance as far as surrounding things of the city. We're talking about things where actually the streets themselves are made of gold, where people actually walk on. So they're actually up close as it relates to this whole thing of gold, of the gold of the city. Not only just the walls or anything like that or anything else surrounding the city, but actually the streets themselves are of gold as well. Now remember, though, we're describing these things in symbolic terms. This isn't saying, again, since we're not talking about a geographic area here, that's going to be a literal geographic place in the new heavens and the new earth. This isn't, we're not talking about a literal streets of gold in an actual literal geographic city. Again, this is describing the people of God. Okay, that's stretched to the limits here. And by the way, just to point something out here, because, a lot of people talk about streets of gold and everything like that. And a lot of people associate the streets of gold with heaven. Oh, when you get to heaven, there's going to be streets of gold. And I think that they pull mainly from this passage here in Revelation 21. I don't think there's, at least from my recollection, in other parts of Scripture that describes heaven, that describes it as streets of gold. I'll have to look into that. But I think mostly and primarily what people draw from as far as heaven and streets of gold is here in chapter 21. Well, guess what, though? Chapter 21 isn't describing heaven. It's describing again, even if we're looking at this as a literal, geographic city, it's not in heaven. It's come down from heaven, but it's in the new heavens and the new earth. So even there, people's understanding and interpretations of things are off because, we haven't really paid attention to what's laid out to us in Scripture there. But we don't have to spend a great deal of time on that. But again, you see the immense beauty of the people of God, the New Jerusalem. And let me just remind you of this as we draw to a close here. Is that this isn't a beauty of our own. This isn't a beauty that we worked our way up to, even now working our way up to for this point when we get to this whole thing of the new heavens and the new earth. The beauty is a beauty that comes from God himself in his radiant glory. And I think that that's really what we need to grasp onto there. And so, this, not only this, but even just the whole chapter, even what we've read up to this point, speaks of beauty and just glory and just tremendous blessing. Okay. And so this is something that will describe us. And so, this is how God is going to make us. This is how we are going. I mean, again, this isn't how we're literally going to appear again. These are symbolic pictures to just show and tell the hearer and the reader, look, you as the bride, as the people of God, in her completeness and in her fullness at the end of human history is going to look incredibly beautiful the way God intended you to look. Okay. And that's the thing. And that's not to say that we're ugly now. That's not to say that at all. I mean, like, all of us have the perfection of Christ's righteousness imputed to us. So God already sees beauty because he sees the perfection of Christ credited to our account. That's justification. But again, even so, we still sin. We still struggle with sin and everything like that. When we get to eternity and when we get to that eternal state, everything is going to be so out of this world, including us. And the descriptions and the dimensions that are meant to be out of this world are laid forth here to make us lean back and think and say, wow, just wow. So take this and take everything that we've looked at up to this point in chapter 21, and you see something pretty glorious here. Something truly, truly amazing and glorious. And so the last part of the descriptions here, we're going to look at the last part of this, verses 22 through 27 next time. What is it meaning when it's talking about there's going to be no temple and that God is our temple and there's no need for sun or moon and everything like that? And where are those descriptions coming from? Because those do have an origin in other parts of Scripture. And by this time, in our study of the book of Revelation, that shouldn't surprise you at all. Okay. Shouldn't surprise you at all. So that's really what what we've dealt with just in our passage here, and what we've already read, what we're going to look at next time. So what we have looking forward to that. And then once we get done with next week, we will have finished chapter 21. So again, a lot of good and exciting things that are still in store. And even when we get into chapter 22, which is the last chapter in the book of Revelation, can you believe it? That we're coming close to the end here. It's been a tremendous and wonderful journey, and it's going to be good, to finally come to an end. Not because we haven't enjoyed studying the book of Revelation, but to have studied the book in its completeness, and just to mine out the wondrous glory and the descriptions there, and just who our God is, and just how Jesus Christ is revealed. I mean, again, that's what we're dealing with, the revelation of Jesus Christ. And our hearts and our gaze is on him and his beauty and his wonder. Really, I think that's really what we're supposed to see as we study this book. And hopefully that's been part of your experience and mine as we've gone through the study of this book. Okay, so that will do it for our time here. We'll leave it there for now. If you enjoy this show and you haven't done so already, I encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, and Spotify. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And also don't forget to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com are the main places that you can order a copy of that, read it, and be blessed. All right. Had a great time going through this immense richness of Scripture and the passage that we looked at today. I hope that you enjoyed it as well. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.